Hi folks, let's talk a little bit about definition, and I'd like to give you some context and a few starting points to how to construct a definition essay. So first of all, what is definition? So definition is the first of the most basic principles of rational thought. So we have definition. The other two are analogy, which is you might also think about as comparison contrast, and then the last is cause and effect. But definition is really the most basic of those, and you can think about this in the way that children think. Children often ask questions that are definition questions. What is lightning, right? And so you can see a child attempt to put things in a category or to take things from an unknown to a known. Right? And so definition is also called generalization or categorization. Again, putting things in categories or looking at a thing's traits and putting it together with other things, right? So definition is the process of moving from abstract to concrete or specific. You also might think about it as a process of nailing down what a thing is, what it consists of, or what category it falls in. So an illustration here following are some questions that you might use to nail down an abstract noun like success. And I'm not going to read through these. You can read through these and maybe even use these for yours. But this is a way to start looking at a thing, start analyzing a thing, an abstract noun, and trying to get to something that's, again, more concrete, right? 3 rules for defining. So these are borrowed from Corbett and Connor's Classical Rhetoric for the Modern Student. So first, the defining term should be clearer and more familiar than the term to be defined, right? So obviously, you know, the idea is you're starting with something that's unknown or abstract or unclear, and you are attempting to make it more clear, right? And more familiar to the reader. The definition should not repeat the term to be defined or use synonyms or derivative terms. And this is probably the most common error. You don't want to use the same word in your definition. You can't define a word with that word, okay? Or merely writing synonyms for that word, okay? It's got to reduce, the definition that you're doing has got to reduce the abstraction to something that's concrete and specific. And ideally, the definition, wherever possible, should be stated positively, not negatively. And you can see here, wherever possible, which means there's some leeway in this particular rule. But ideally, you should be stating something positively rather than negatively. And that means this. So happiness is something, right? That's a positive statement rather than a negative statement. Happiness is not blank. So you were thinking in is statements rather than is not statements. That's fairly typical for a definition. Now, again, there is some leeway here, but ideally you want to be thinking positively rather than negatively, is rather than is not. Organization is fairly straightforward. 1 body paragraph for an introduction, and then you're probably going to have 3 or 4 body paragraphs for this particular essay. And those 3 or 4 body paragraphs each need to revolve around a characteristic, a trait, a concrete specific part of your definition, right? And so a way to think about this is each of the paragraphs need to address these questions. So you are either going to be dealing with suffering or happiness, right? So each paragraph needs to answer, what does suffering look like according to the author or in the experience of the author? Right? Again, as you're using texts that we're reading in the course to do this paper, or what is or are the most important characteristics of suffering or unhappiness, right? So if you're doing suffering, each of those body paragraphs should address some different aspect of that definition, should answer this question in some slightly different way. The same goes if you deal with the sort of the opposite side of the coin, happiness. What does happiness look like according to the author or in the experience of the author? What is or are the most important characteristics of happiness? Again, each body paragraph answering that question in some specific way that's different from the other body paragraphs. And then, of course, you're going to have a 1 paragraph conclusion. And I've said here, nota bene, note well, your essays go as your thesis and topic sentences go. And that's not just for this essay, but that's for every essay that you do. Aim to achieve a sharp thesis statement and sharp, clear topic sentences that are clear, concise, and specific. And the more you do that, the easier it is to write the paper and the better the product is going to be. So spend time crafting the thesis statement and crafting the topic sentences. And for this paper, it can be helpful to actually start with the topic sentences to come up with your mini definitions and then sort of put it all together. So finally here, I've offered a jumping off point. I'm not going to go through all of these questions, but as you are reading through the texts and trying to come up with definition of either suffering or happiness in those texts, it might be useful to consider these statements. And again, just sort of use these and ask these questions of yourself to try and generate some ideas for your thesis and for your topic sentences. So look through these and use them to ask some analytical questions that will lead to topic sentences. Next thing I'm going to do is walk you through a student paper here. And really this is not of course not the whole paper, but this is just a sample of the focus of the paper. The thesis and topic sentence outline, I've just borrowed that from taking those out of the essay itself. And I've done that because this was generally a useful essay with good analysis, but the focus was pretty loose. And I want to illustrate how you might go from loose, abstract, unclear focus to a little bit more clear and a little bit more concrete. So the text in italics is text that I've created based on what the topic sentence could or should have been. So you can see here the thesis, right? The trick about happiness is that we all carry our own definition of it. In Huckleberry Finn, both Huck and the widow demonstrate their own definition of happiness. Huck reacts negatively when the widow attempts to impose her definition on him. So unfortunately in this thesis, we don't really get anything that is a definition. We don't get anything about characteristics or traits. We really get more cause and effect. Huck reacts negatively, right? Which is not what the purpose of this paper. The purpose is to break down one of these characters' ideas about suffering or happiness, right? So this thesis is pretty loose, and I think that actually caused the rest of the focus to go off a little bit and not be specific. So you can see the first sentence here. Huck defines happiness for himself as freely doing what he wants when he wants. Which is okay, but really we could use some better key terms and be a little bit more specific there, right? So I've revised it based on what was in the rest of the paragraph when there was some useful analysis. Huck defines happiness as freedom from social rules, a key term, social rules on behavior and manners, because that's what the rest of the paragraph is about, right? And so he sees happiness as being free from those things. How he ought to dress, smoking, cussing, these kinds of things. He rejects those and he sees happiness as being free from those things, right? And that's, again, what this writer had talked about in the paragraph, but we don't get any of those key terms here in this given topic sentence, okay? The next topic sentence here, being that happiness is a trait, this may be influenced by environment. Again, not a great sentence itself. We have some clunkiness there. The widow illustrates her own belief of what happiness is through living a civilized life and finding a connection in religion. Okay, so we have a little bit of an idea of where this paragraph would go because we got this idea of religion here, right? And we have civilized life as a key term that's used in the text in Huckleberry Finn. By the way, this paper is about the first 2 chapters there. But we could still really nail this down a little bit better. So I wrote this one, again, based on the development, the details and analysis in this student's own paragraph. Huck rejects traditional religion as a source of happiness because while he finds the stories interesting, he does not believe the past can impact his life in a meaningful way. So Huck says that these are really good stories, I like them, but this is not part of happiness. This does not bring me happiness, right? Those things were in the past. They don't impact me. They are just interesting stories, right? And that's a noticeable concern of his in the first couple of chapters, right? He rejects traditional religion as not a source of happiness for him, right? Okay. Next, Huck complains about the things that bother him about living with the widow and doing things differently from what he believes will bring him happiness. Again, this one's pretty vague, right? It's not really clear what that paragraph would be about. There's not anything concrete there. But again, the student had useful analysis and dealt with order and stability and actually used these words elsewhere in the paragraph. So something like this: while the widow believes that order and stability lead to a satisfied life, Huck rejects what he calls a dismal, regular, and decent life. I missed that part, right? So again, this concept of order and stability was present in the rest of the paragraph, but not dealt with and not nailed down and defined and used in the topic sentence. So make sure you're using key terms that clearly relate back to the thesis statement and advance the thesis statement. And finally, here in the conclusion, both definitions opposing each other, again, clunky structure. The widow, being an experienced older lady, finds happiness to be living in a stable and civilized home. Okay, so these are key terms. While Huck finds happiness to be having the freedom to do what he wants. Again, another key term. So this concluding statement is actually more specific than the thesis statement itself. And you're going to find very often that it takes you until the end of your paper to find what you want to say. So it is very often that you can go to your conclusion and maybe even find a better thesis statement than what is in your introduction. But I hope this is helpful in illustrating moving from abstract to concrete and then making those things more specific and more clear, right? So this paper is really about making sure you're coming up with good, clear, specific definitions. So if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me. Thanks.